Harwick, Alberta, autumn of 1912. The cold came early that year, the kind that settled into the bones of the land before October had finished. The wheat fields had already gone amber and dry, and the Harwick grain elevator stood silent at the edge of town like a man with nothing left to say. It was on a Thursday morning, sharp and windless, that Louisa Pratt was made to stand in front of the town council chambers, while her father-in-law read from a paper he had written himself. She was 28 years old. She wore her good wool coat, the gray one with the missing button at the collar, because she had not thought to prepare for humiliation. She had thought it was going to be a meeting. She had been wrong about that. The paper said she was dishonest, that she had influenced her late husband against his family, that she had taken money from the household accounts that were not hers to take. Roland Pratt, 63, broad-shouldered and slow-moving, read every word without looking up at her. His two sons stood to his left, arms crossed. The clerk sat at the table writing everything down. The people of Harwick didn't gather the way people did in the eastern cities. They didn't crowd or shout. They stood at a respectful distance and let it happen, the way prairie people let a bad storm pass. You didn't run from it, you just bore it. Louisa did not speak. She had spoken 2 weeks before, when they first brought the accusations to her in the kitchen of the farmhouse she had shared with her husband for 6 years. She had explained that the money was her own. Money from the sale of her mother's sewing machine. Money she had earned giving music lessons to the Fry children and the Hendersons up on the Ridge Road. She had explained it clearly, calmly, with the receipts she had kept in a tin box under the bed. They had listened. Then they had proceeded anyway. So she stood still now, in the October cold, while the paper was read, and she told herself she would not cry. And she did not cry, because she had done that already and it had not helped either. Afterward, Roland Pratt walked past her without meeting her eyes. His sons followed. The clerk folded the paper and tucked it into a leather binder. Only one person lingered. He was leaning against the cedar railing at the far side of the steps, a man in a dark coat that had seen better seasons, his hat pulled low against the wind that had just begun to pick up. He was watching. Not the way the others had watched, not with that careful distance, but steadily, like someone doing arithmetic in his head. He was probably 40, maybe a few years past. His face was the kind that didn't give things away easily. He had a scar along his left jaw, faded to silver, and his hands, when he pushed off the railing, were the hands of someone who worked with them every day. He did not introduce himself. He simply came to stand beside her as she gathered herself and said, quietly, to no one in particular, that paper had no legal standing. Louisa looked at him. The council has no authority over a widow's personal property in this province, he said. Not since 1910. She studied him for a moment. Are you a lawyer? No. Then, what are you? He glanced toward the road. Someone who reads. His name, she would learn later, was Ewan Sutherland. He was a grain farmer from 11 kilometers outside Harwick, and he lived alone in a house on the Pemberton Road with his 3 children, a girl of 13 named Cecily, and 2 younger boys, Peter and Amos, 9 and 7. His wife, Agnes, had died of a fever the previous winter, the kind that swept through the farming communities that year, and chose who it wanted without apparent reason. He had a reputation in Harwick as a fair man and a quiet one. He paid his debts on time. He did not drink heavily. He had not, in the year since Agnes died, asked for anything from anyone that he hadn't earned. The reason he had been in town that Thursday morning was to file paperwork for the following season's seed order. He had not come to attend any council proceeding. He had simply heard the reading through the open window and stopped. He offered her a ride back toward the Pemberton Road because she had walked into town and the wind was sharpening. She accepted because she had no good reason not to, and a long walk to consider. They rode most of the way in silence, the wagon wheels cutting through the first thin frost on the road. The poplar trees along the fence line had gone yellow, and their leaves moved in small, nervous clusters in the wind. "Where will you go?" he asked. "Somewhere past the second concession road." "I have an aunt in Medicine Hat," she said. "I can write to her." He nodded once, as if that answered something. She would have gone too. She had already decided it on the walk into town that morning, before the reading, before the clerk wrote everything down, before the Pratt sons stood there with their arms folded. She would write to Aunt Helen. She would find work. She was a capable woman. She knew how to teach piano, and how to put up preserves, and how to balance a ledger, and she was not afraid of hard work, only of the particular kind of smallness that came from being accused of things you had not done by people who did not intend to listen. Ewan Sutherland stopped the wagon at the fork of the Pemberton Road and the Miller Creek Trail. "I need someone at the house," he said. He was looking at the road ahead, not at her. "My sister came after Agnes died, but she's gone back to Brandon. The children are managing, but Cecily is doing more than a 13-year-old should." Louisa waited. "I'm not asking for anything that isn't square," he said. "Room and meals and a fair wage. I'd write it down if you wanted it written." She looked at the side of his face. He still wasn't looking at her. "You don't know me," she said. "I know you didn't take that money." She was quiet for a moment. "How?" "Because you kept receipts," he said. "And you're the kind of woman who keeps receipts." She did not know what to say to that. She looked out at the fields stretching away from the road, dry and flat and going gray in the autumn light. "All right," she said. The house on the Pemberton Road was larger than she had expected. A 2-story farmhouse, white clapboard gone slightly gray with weather. A porch that wrapped around the south side. A root cellar built into the slope behind the barn. Inside it was orderly in the way that men's houses became orderly after women left them. Everything in its place but the warmth gone out of it. The curtains were plain. The shelf above the stove had 3 tins and a cracked cup. There were children's drawings tacked to the wall beside the kitchen door, slightly crooked, never straightened. The 3 children sussed in the kitchen when Ewan brought her in. Cecily was tall for her age, with dark hair pulled back in a practical braid and an expression that had clearly been practiced to reveal very little. She looked at Louisa the way you look at weather, assessing what's coming and preparing accordingly. The 2 boys, Peter and Amos, were damp-cheeked and wide-eyed. Peter slightly behind his brother, Amos slightly in front. "This is Mrs. Pratt," Ewan said. "She'll be staying to help around the house." No one spoke. Then Amos said, "Do you know how to make ginger biscuits?" "Amos," Cecily said flatly. "I do," Louisa said. Amos considered this. "All right then," he said, as if that settled things to his satisfaction, and went back to whatever he had been doing at the table. The first week was careful and quiet. Louisa learned the geography of the house. Which door stuck, which stoveplate ran too hot, where Cecily had hidden her mother's good sewing scissors so the boys wouldn't lose them. She did not ask about Agnes. She did not rearrange anything that didn't need rearranging. She made the ginger biscuits, and she made them correctly, which Amos noted with a brief and solemn nod. Cecily watched everything. She helped, when asked, with the efficiency of someone who had been helping for a long time and wasn't sure whether to resent it or not. She did not warm to Louisa quickly. That was fine. Louisa did not expect it and did not push. The thing that got her was the piano. There was an upright against the sitting room wall, its wood darkened with age, several keys slightly uneven. Agnes had played, Ewan mentioned once, passing through the room. The children had had some lessons. The piano had not been opened since February. Louisa did not touch it, not the first week, not the second, but on the 3rd Sunday, Amos came and stood in the doorway of the sitting room where she was mending one of Peter's shirts and said, "You said you teach piano." "I did." "Could you teach me?" Cecily appeared behind him. "You don't have to," she said to Louisa, with her chin up slightly, as if the offer might be refused. "I'd like to," Louisa said simply, and she meant it. She sat beside Amos on the bench that evening and started where all beginners started, and Amos was terrible, which was exactly as it should be. and he laughed at his own mistakes in a way that loosened something in the room. Peter drifted in after a while and sat on the floor. Cecily stood in the doorway. She stood there for a long time before she came to sit in the chair by the window. She didn't say anything, but she stayed. It was early November when the trouble came from town. Ewan had gone in for supplies. Louisa was at the house with the children when Roland Pratt's eldest son, Franklin, appeared at the gate on horseback with another man she didn't know. She recognized Franklin immediately. The same square jaw as his father, the same way of holding his shoulders forward like he expected resistance. She came to the porch and said nothing. "My father wants the tin box," Franklin said. "The one with the receipts and papers. That box belongs to me," she said. "My father says differently. Your father can say what he likes." She kept her voice even. "It has my name on the receipts inside it, and it's mine." Franklin's companion, younger, with a kerchief at his neck, shifted on his horse and looked at the ground. He clearly hadn't expected the conversation to go this direction. "You're living on charity," Franklin said, and there was something beneath the words that was meant to land hard. "Don't make it worse." She looked at him, not through him, not past him, directly at him. "I am living on earned wages in exchange for legitimate work," she said, "which is more than your father's reading of that paper ever established." Franklin opened his mouth. Behind her, the porch boards creaked. Ewan had come around from the barn, not from the road. He had been home for an hour already and she hadn't heard him return. He stood at the corner of the porch, with a fence post in one hand that he'd been carrying, and he looked at Franklin Pratt the way you look at a gate that's hung wrong. Not with anger, just with the quiet intention of correcting it. "She said it's hers," Ewan said. "I'd take her at her word." Franklin's horse shifted. Franklin steadied it. The two men looked at each other for a long moment, and whatever Franklin saw in Ewan's face, or in the fence post, or in the plain fact of the situation, made him pull his reins to the left. "This isn't finished," Franklin said. "It is for today," Ewan said. They rode back toward the road. Louisa stayed on the porch until she could no longer hear the horses. Then she sat down on the step, her hands in her lap, and breathed. Ewan leaned the fence post against the railing and sat beside her. Not close, just near. "Thank you," she said. He shook his head like thanks wasn't the right unit of measure for what had just happened. "Did he frighten you?" She thought about it honestly. "No, that's the strange part." He looked out at the road. "Why strange?" "Because things like that used to," she said. "Before." He was quiet for a moment. "Before your husband died?" "Before I stopped having anything left to lose," she said. And then, hearing herself, added, "That sounds worse than I mean it." "No, it doesn't," he said. And that was all he said about it. That night she lay in the narrow room at the top of the stairs and stared at the ceiling boards and thought about the strange arithmetic of where she had ended up. 6 weeks ago she had been standing in front of the council chambers in a coat with a missing button, and now she was here, in a house that was not hers but felt. In some quiet, working way, like a place that had room for her in it. She was not foolish enough to call it anything yet. But she stopped writing the letter to Aunt Helen in Medicine Hat. Not forever. Just for now. Winter arrived and with it a different weight. The roads became impassable some mornings. The children were home more, which meant the house was fuller and louder, and required a different kind of management. Peter had nightmares that woke him twice a week, and Louisa learned to hear him through the wall before he fully woke himself. And she learned that a glass of warm water and 5 minutes of quiet company was usually enough. She didn't tell Ewan about this. He had enough to carry. One night she heard him at the kitchen table at 2 in the morning, and she came down and found him sitting with a ledger open in front of him and his face in his hands. The lamp was low. The stove had gone nearly cold. "The east field flooded in the spring," he said, without looking up. He had heard her on the stairs. "The drainage ditch isn't holding. If I can't fix it before seeding, I'll lose that section again." She pulled out the chair across from him and sat. What does it cost to fix it properly? He named a number. She did arithmetic in her head. I have money, she said. The music lesson money, what's left of it, and I have what you've paid me. He looked up. No, it's not a gift, she said. I'd want it back when the harvest comes in, with a fair return. Louisa, it's a practical arrangement, she said. I'm living in your house. It's in my interest for the land to produce. He looked at her for a long moment, and she could see him working through the arguments against it and finding them insufficient. You're very practical, he said. I've had to be, she said. He took the money. He repaid it in September, with interest that she tried to refuse, and he refused to let her refuse. The east field yielded well. It was not dramatic, and it was not a miracle. It was just what happened when a drainage ditch was fixed properly. Spring came the way it always did on the prairie. Suddenly, after you'd almost stopped believing in it. The mud came first, then the green, then the extraordinary pale blue of an Alberta sky when the season finally remembered what it was. In April, Cecily asked Louisa to help her make a dress for the school concert. Not because she couldn't do it herself. Louisa had seen by now that Cecily was capable of most things she set her mind to, but because she wanted company while she did it. Louisa understood this. She sat across from Cecily at the kitchen table with the fabric between them and let Cecily lead, and handed her things when she needed them, and they talked about the pattern and the length of the hem, and the ribbon color, and other things that were not about Agnes, and at some point, Cecily said without looking up from her pinning, she would have liked you. Louisa kept her hands still. My mother, Cecily said. She liked people who did things without complaining about it. That's a good quality to appreciate, Louisa said carefully. Cecily was quiet for a moment. I used to be angry, she said. When you first came, I know I'm not now. She said it the same way she said most things, direct, without apology. I thought you should know. Louisa looked at her. This tall, serious girl with her mother's scissors and her father's steadiness, and felt something catch in her chest that she didn't have a name for yet. Thank you, she said. That means a great deal to me. Cecily nodded once, briskly, and went back to her pinning. The town of Harwick did not change its opinion of Louisa Pratt quickly or easily. Some people stopped and spoke to her warmly when she came in with Ewan's wagon for supplies. Others looked away, or said nothing, or found reasons to be occupied elsewhere. She had learned not to measure herself by who acknowledged her and who didn't. But in May, on a warm Tuesday when she had gone in alone for flour and postal correspondence, she was standing outside Devlin's dry goods store when she heard a voice she recognized. Roland Pratt, and with him a woman she didn't know, who was young and well-dressed and laughing at something in the way of people who didn't know yet what there was to stop laughing about. Louisa stood her ground. She had the flour and the mail, and there was no reason to move from where she was. Roland saw her. He stopped. The woman with him looked between them with the mild curiosity of the uninformed. Mrs. Pratt, he said. His voice was the same as always, steady, certain of its own authority, but his eyes moved away from hers too quickly. Mr. Pratt, she said, and that was all that happened. He walked on. The woman with him gave Louisa a small, puzzled smile and followed. Louisa walked to the wagon. She set the flour down and stood there in the May sunshine for a moment, and discovered with some surprise that she felt nothing in particular. Not triumph, not grief, not the cold burn of injustice that used to rise in her chest when she thought of that paper and the clerk writing it all down. She felt the sun on her face and heard a meadowlark somewhere on the edge of the field past the feed store, and thought, there it is! There it is! She was thinking about that, about the meadowlark and the absence of the old burning, when she got back to the Pemberton Road that afternoon, and found Ewan resetting a fence post near the gate. He looked up as she pulled in. Any trouble? Saw Roland Pratt, she said. He stopped what he was doing and looked at her. And nothing, she said. That's the thing. Nothing. He studied her face for a moment, and something in his expression shifted. Not dramatically, not in any way that could be easily described, but it shifted. "Good," he said. She climbed down from the wagon and handed him one end of the flour sack, and he took it, and they carried it inside, and he did not say anything else. But he made the coffee that evening, instead of waiting for her to make it. And he sat at the table and read his paper, and she corrected Peter's arithmetic at the other end of the table. And Amos fell asleep on the sitting room floor, with his boots still on, which Cecily pointed out to everyone twice without doing anything about it. It was an ordinary evening. It was one of the best evenings she could remember in years. The conversation happened on the porch in early June, the night the fireflies first appeared over the low grass at the edge of the property. She hadn't expected to see fireflies this far north, and she said so. "They come every year," Ewan said. Agnes used to bring the children out to watch. It was the first time he had spoken of Agnes directly to her. She waited. "She was a good woman," he said. "She would have." He paused. "She deserved more time than she got." "Yes," Louisa said. "She did." He was quiet for a long time. Out in the field, the fireflies moved in small, unhurried arcs. "I didn't bring you here because I thought you'd replace her," he said finally. "I want you to know that." "I didn't think that," she said. "I brought you here because you were standing on those steps and it wasn't right," he said. "What happened to you?" "And because Cecily needed—" He stopped again. "The children needed someone." "I know," she said. "But that's not—" He said it, and then stopped himself, and then said it differently. "That's not all it is, anymore." She looked at him, the side of his face, the line of his jaw, the scar that had faded to silver. "No," she said. "It isn't, not for me either." He turned and looked at her then, not searching for something, not measuring, just looking. "I don't have very much to offer," he said. "The farm's in good shape now, but it's not." "Ewan," she said, "I know what you have." "Do you?" "A house that has room in it," she said. "Children who will drive you to your wits' end, and then do something that makes it impossible to be sorry about any of it. A piece of land that fights you every spring and then produces anyway." He was quiet. "And you," she said, "who believed a woman he'd never met because she kept her receipts." Something moved in his face that she recognized, because she had felt the same thing herself. The complicated relief of being seen by someone who wasn't looking for anything other than what was actually there. He reached over and took her hand. Careful, not possessive. "Stay," he said. "I'm not going anywhere," she said, and this time she meant it in every direction. Not because she was needed, not because she had nowhere else, because this was where she wanted to be. They were married in October, a year after she had stood in front of the council chambers in her coat with the missing button. The ceremony was at the Pemberton United Church, small and plain, with the minister and the children, and two neighbors who had become friends over the course of the year. Cecily stood beside Louisa and held the small bunch of late-season chrysanthemums they had cut from the garden that morning. Amos cried, which surprised everyone, especially Amos, who insisted afterward that it had been the cold air. The button had been replaced by then. Louisa had replaced it herself the previous winter with a slightly different one from Ewan's sewing tin. Because the original couldn't be matched. It didn't match perfectly, and for a while it bothered her, and then it didn't, and that was that. The years that followed were not easy in the way that good years are sometimes falsely remembered as easy. There were bad harvests and hard winters, and the particular grief that comes from watching children grow toward their own lives and away from yours. Peter went to Edmonton to study engineering. Amos, improbably, became a school teacher in the Northern Territories and wrote long, detailed letters about his students that Louisa read aloud at the supper table until Ewan had to put down his fork from laughing. Cecily married a man from Red Deer named Douglas, who was solid and kind and slightly intimidated by his wife's directness, which Louisa had told her privately was not a problem, only a feature. The house filled differently as the years passed. Grandchildren appeared at Christmas and in summer, small and unruly and fascinated by the farm's animals in ways that required constant supervision. Louisa taught piano to every one of them who would sit on the bench long enough, which was not all of them but was several. She taught piano in Harwick too, eventually, to the children of families who had once looked past her on the street. She did not hold the past against them. She had found that not holding things against people was mostly better for her own peace than for theirs, but it worked out regardless. The tin box she kept under the new bed in the new room she shared with Ewan, not because the receipts in it still mattered. They had ceased to matter the day a provincial court clerk, contacted on her behalf by a lawyer in Calgary, whom Ewan had written to quietly in the autumn of 1912, confirmed in writing that the Pratt family had no legal claim. She kept it because it had her mother's handwriting on the outside, where she had labeled it in pencil. L's things. Her mother had been gone 8 years by then, but the pencil remained clear, and Louisa was not going to throw that away. In the late years, she sat on the south-facing porch. In the afternoons, when the light was good, and read, or wrote letters, or simply watched the fields that she had come to love in the particular way you love things that have cost you something. Ewan would bring her tea without being asked, because after 30 years he knew when she wanted it, and she would say nothing except, sometimes, thank you, and he would say nothing except sometimes, of course. He went first in the spring, the way the good ones sometimes did, quietly in his chair with the window open, and the smell of the fields coming in, and Louisa beside him, her hand in his. She planted a rose along the south fence, a tough prairie variety that the nurseryman in town had told her was nearly impossible to kill, and she told him that was exactly what she needed. It bloomed every summer after that, even in the bad years, when she herself was buried in the churchyard beside Ewan, beneath the name she had chosen to keep when all the other things were being taken from her. Cecily gave the eulogy, and it was the kind of eulogy that made people laugh and weep in the same breath, which Louisa would have considered ideal. Above the gate to the farm, Amos had hung a plank of wood the winter before, carved with the kind of careful, unhurried attention his father had once applied to everything, and what it said was simple. She came with nothing but the truth of what was hers. She left us more than we knew how to count. The rose was still blooming when they carried her out. Some things, once rooted in the right ground, simply do not stop.